From 1999 to 2003, the Wachowskis created the original Matrix trilogy, a series of films that spoke about the idea of our world being a simulated reality, a result of our loss of control on our technological advancements. This story, told over 3 films, was the backdrop for numerous action sequences that helped expose Western audiences to elements of East Asian cinema, by combining techniques of action choreography and cinematography from that film industry with those of the American film industry. Now, as far as what the Wachowskis were really trying to say in their original trilogy, that remains up for debate. What is clear, however, is that the general reception to the films waned with each successive release. Regardless, by the end of the Matrix Revolutions, the story was closed, and the Matrix as a film series went dormant. Fast forward 18 years, however, and we suddenly have a new film in the series, Matrix Resurrections. This film returns a significant portion of the principal cast and characters from the original trilogy, and continues the story these people were involved in almost 2 decades ago. Reception to this new film has been, to say the least, polarizing, with a portion of the crowd being very critical, even suggesting it a failure, but, more generally, questioning whether or not it justifies its own existence. Thus, the question, which is the title of this video, has been heavily asked: is Matrix Resurrections bad? Well, I'm gonna get right to the point. No, I don't think the film is bad. In fact, not even close. But the reason why might surprise you. Before we get into that, though, there's something else I have to explain first. In scientific literature, a primary way in which we've improved our understanding is through the conduction of research studies. These studies, or experiments, while they do have differences between each other depending on the field with which they're concerned, all have some key commonalities. Research studies require researchers, or somebody who will conduct the experiment, a population, which is just a group of people who are willing to take part in the study, an intervention, some thing that the participants are exposed to during the study, and a collection and analysis of results. Now, before we lose track, no, this is certainly not the whole list of elements that research studies have in common, and certainly not all research is conducted in this way. But for the purposes of our analogy, this list is all we're concerned with. Now, a good researcher knows that in order to get results that are useful, you want to try and account for as many different variables that could affect the outcome of your study as possible. Let's say you're trying to test the effectiveness of some fancy new warm-up routine on the performance of college long jumpers. If you want to really clearly test the effectiveness of that routine, you'd want to try and control the athletes' training regimens, maybe their body composition, have a fairly uniform demographic of participants, the weather maybe if you're doing the testing outside, etc. If you don't do these things, then it becomes much more difficult to determine if the warm-up routine was the primary factor involved in any change in performance, even if the reasoning behind the routine is great. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, that makes sense, but how does this have anything to do with Matrix Resurrections being good or bad? You've probably heard the phrase, the worst thing a movie can do is be boring. Well, what if we instead said, the worst thing a movie can be is not useful? Let's translate our analogy to the film. Since the director is typically the one who has the most creative influence, we'll call them our researcher. Our population in this study is you, the audience. This is a combination of both movie critics and the general population. Our treatment will be the film itself, and our results will be the reaction to the film. In our case, having a high-quality researcher is the same as having a very competent director. I'm sure everybody probably has differing opinions on the Wachowskis in this case, but regardless of what you think about their competency, if you can't guarantee quality with the director, the next best thing, I think, would be to get the person who was involved in the original trilogy to helm the new film. Granted, we only had one half of the Wachowskis, Lana, directing and writing this time, but that aspect is accounted for. The audience doesn't need to be controlled in any way, obviously, and the reactions to the film are what they are. So that just leaves the film itself, our treatment. And in this case also, I think a lot of the variables are controlled for. This film returns a big chunk of the same cast and characters from the original series, and the story is a direct continuation of the one from those films as well. Greater funding certainly helps to improve the quality of research studies too, and Matrix Resurrections didn't have a small budget by any means, so I doubt there were a lot of creative compromises needed from the cast and crew due to any monetary constraints. All of this to say that Matrix Resurrections as a film is so effectively realized that it is that much easier to determine what perhaps didn't work and what did. Now, I suppose I should mention that I've always been a huge fan of the original films. I think being a very young kid when they came out probably helped with the impression they left on me, but in any case, it's something to keep in mind throughout this video. The first place I want to start is just with the narrative. One of the biggest developments over the course of the original trilogy is how the relationship between Neo and Trinity gradually took up more of the runtime. In fact, I would say, in general, that the whole narrative took more of the focus as the series went on. This trend continues into Resurrections as well, and I think it's hard to argue that this newest film is by far the most narratively driven out of all of them. The original film, more than anything, feels like an action film that transitions fairly naturally between big sequences, with its sci-fi premise as a backdrop to allow the filmmakers to utilize imaginative elements that wouldn't really be justifiable otherwise. Reloaded certainly feels this way also, but to a lesser extent. Revolutions and Resurrections, in my opinion, continue to move further away from action-focused films, even though big action moments are certainly still present in both of them. Now, this could suggest that it was the specific execution of the action scenes that was a big strength in the original films, something that helps the films less if it isn't included as much. If we talk about specific execution, we can find another stark difference. For me, the single biggest difference I notice about this film compared to the original films is how some of the action scenes were shot. There's one scene in particular that was so jarring. Not necessarily in a good or bad way, but I can't think of another word for it. When Neo's game dev studio is raided, there's a scene where he's crawling around amongst the desks being soaked by fire sprinklers. I would say a hallmark of the series prior was the fact that most shots, and particularly the action shots, were semi-long wide shots. Most of, if not all of each character was typically always in frame. This scene in Resurrection was instead shot in telephoto, using a lot of close-ups. Some of the other action set pieces incorporated this type of filming as well. For some, this could seem as an odd choice since shots like these objectively show less of the action in the frame than wide shots do. I know people have also been critical of the special effects in specific cases, and while I do agree they don't look as good as they probably should at this point, I'm not sure if they play a big role in the general consensus of the film. I don't think they really affect a viewer's ability to follow what's happening in any of the scenes where they're used, but I do think they could be viewed as a detriment to the story elements they serve. In the original films, Neo developed this ability to stop bullets being fired at him. It was used once in the first film and once in the second film, and both instances felt more like a piece of the action for the scenes they were used in. They expanded more so on the action in these cases. In Resurrections, however, this element, while explained enough by the narrative, feels more like an alternative to more elaborate action sequences. Now, we can really only speculate about this idea, but again, with the budget they had, I find it hard to believe that any significant creative compromises would have been taken. And from a narrative standpoint, it's also hard to speculate how much creative control Lana would have had, but considering the self-referential elements and the sort of jokes the movie makes about Warner Brothers, I also think it's safe to say that she had a pretty strong creative license during making of the film. Some of these decisions feel to me like maybe a result of lower standards, but it might be hard to avoid. I mean, all of the returning principal crew are almost 20 years older than they were at the time of the conclusion of filming for the original trilogy, so the physicality of their actions maybe couldn't have been as pronounced as they were before. And that's not to say that Moss and Reeves aren't good at what they do, but it's a lot of physical work to create scenes with elaborate wire stunts like some of those in the original trilogy, and actors like Donnie Yen, Jason Statham, Michelle Yeoh, Tom Cruise, they're all exceptional in their abilities to endure those physical demands into middle age. Now, there is one aspect of the film I'd like to follow up on, and that's because I thought it was done fairly well. The narrative. Certainly not everybody's going to like the story being told, but to me, it felt like a good example of how to continue a story that could have been definitively closed by the end of the third film. Something I absolutely despise is when a sequel renders events of previous entries meaningless. Characters go through this arduous journey to accomplish some difficult task, and in the next film, everything is suddenly pointless somehow. Resurrections doesn't do this, in my opinion, and this element, coupled with the fact that the creators needed to bring people up to speed with where things were left off in the third film, needless to say, I was pretty damn impressed. Again, the story won't work with everyone, something that's been made clear based on reactions to the film, but I think it could be worth looking at as potential writer or director about what perhaps works and what doesn't work in this way. You know, I walked away from this movie feeling like it was a fantastic example of something being more than the sum of its parts. I couldn't say specifically why I liked it, but I did. I think a large part of that is that I really love the characters in these films, but I think another part of it is that the crew involved really seems to care too, something that can go a long way with a film series. Granted, all of this is my opinion, but it's meant to show one way in which this film could be used to improve the making of films going forward. This series as a whole can essentially create a frame of reference that one can defer to if they're trying to make a movie with similar themes or elements to these, hopefully to better inform what may or may not work in their film. The Matrix series isn't the only modern major motion series that we can look at in this way. We have the Star Wars sequel trilogy, the Harry Potter and Fantastic Beasts series, and at this point, we have 4 different high-profile Batman adaptations that are all distinctly different in their own ways. And hey, any of these films could have their own videos on them as well. If you're interested, leave a suggestion in the comments. What I would encourage everybody to try is think not about whether a movie is bad, but if it's actually that you just don't like it. Of course, I'm adamantly opposed to films that intentionally promote harmful subject matter, but that's a far cry from a movie that unintentionally falls short in some way. I think we can always learn a lot from any movie that comes out. At this point, I typically walk away from all movies that I don't like, feeling mostly just grateful that they exist. Now, this is for a number of different reasons, but the sentiment I'm trying to express in this video is definitely the biggest reason. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, then subscribing and leaving a like and a comment below would be greatly appreciated, because I'd love to see what all of you think about this topic as well. Look forward to more videos like this soon, and I'll see you next time.